Welcome to the 2010 M&N Producers Candidate Forum. This is a public service to help you, the viewer, listen to the words of all the great people who are running for office in New York City and make the best decision. Today we are joined by Mr. Basil Smikle, Jr., a graduate of Cornell University, as well as Columbia's School of Public Affairs, as well as the founder of Basil Smikle and Associates, a political strategy and PR firm here in Manhattan.
Right.
Welcome, Mr. Smikle.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Please tell us a little bit about yourself and about your campaign.
Sure. I am a child of Jamaican immigrants who came to this country in 1970. My father is a retired textile worker. My mother, a current special ed teacher and proud UFT member for about 26 years now, and raised me to believe in the principles of accountability and achievement. So much so that my mother used to talk about how in Jamaica they used to publish standardized test scores in the newspaper so that the entire community knew how well or how not so well your child did. But she raised me on those principles and with that sense of accountability. And that became the foundation for my educational experience. She had a choice and worked a lot, and my father worked multiple jobs to give me the choice of schools, and I went to some good schools in the neighborhood. Went on to Cornell to do a labor relations degree, and Columbia to do a master's in public policy. But in my career with Freddie Ferrer and Hillary Clinton and starting my company in 2003, I've always tried to find a way to have the greatest impact on public policy issues and the greatest impact in my community. So I've done things like work with 100 Black Men, which I'm a member, to start the Eagle Academy in the Bronx. I was involved in a program to get people from public assistance into the workforce for the city of Indianapolis. I've traveled with the Clinton Foundation to talk about and to help address AIDS in Africa. So I've had a number of amazing experiences which I think education opened the door to. And really what I am focused on is trying to talk about how education could be that window, that doorway to opportunity for a lot of the folks that are in my community right now.
Can you describe your district? Because it isn't, we've been talking a lot about Harlem, and I know it's not entirely in Harlem. Can you describe the sort of what makes up the district and the other constituencies beyond the sort of Harlem geography?
Certainly. The district goes roughly from 81st, 82nd Street, Central Park West to Columbus. It gets a little fatter in the 90s. We generally do not have Riverside, West End, Broadway, with a bit of an example in the 130s, but the district gets a bit fatter in the 90s, and we have West Central Harlem, a little piece of East Harlem, and we go up to Washington Heights to about 171st Street. So you have it's a very large swath of land and a very diverse district.
Where could the regular voting public find you eating out? Like, what are your favorite spots going from 81st up to Harlem and across to the East Side?
I spend a lot of time at a few places. Kitchenette on Amsterdam near 123rd. In fact, I just had coffee there earlier today. I am at Londell's a lot, between 139th and 140th on 8th Avenue. There is a little cafe in the Audubon building where the Audubon Ballroom sits. That is a really nice little coffee shop that's there. You may also find me at Café du Soleil on Broadway. They have these really good crepes with chicken and white wine reduction. And but I'm also at Sylvia's. I'm also at Setapani, which is on Lenox Avenue. A fantastic. It used to be a coffee shop. Now it's a restaurant, and they serve fantastic food there. At Melba's and at Mocha's, which are pretty much right across from each other for the most part, on 8th Avenue, which I talked about earlier. And you know, sometimes you'll also see me in the gym on 145th Street, the New York Sports Club. Some will beg to differ. They haven't seen me there in a while, but I'm off. You might often find me there. Now I have to be there. Now I have to go.
When you're elected state senator, what will you be able to do differently to make a difference for Harlemites?
Leadership is not just actually being able to do your job, it's also being able to marshal resources. So as a state senator, certainly I would be mindful of legislation that would preserve affordable housing as well as create it so that there's no net loss. To talk about ways in which you can get some of the small businesses to expand or create ones that don't exist so that people have access to jobs within that community. And also to really find ways to go into every single school in the district and ask the principals and the teachers and the parents, what do you need? How can we bring resources to this school to actually start to fulfill some of the benchmarks and milestones that you'd like to see as an educator, as a teacher, as a leader? So there are a number of things that can be done in Albany, but it's also just about the kind of leadership that you show on the ground day in and day out as part of your job.
For kids graduating from school right now and in the next few years, how have the opportunities for jobs changed, and how will you work to improve those opportunities? I
actually have spoken at 3 graduations in 2 days. I went to a school this morning, didn't have a computer lab. I spoke at a graduation last night for a school that I went to see their library, a high school. I went to see their library and I probably had more books in my collection than they did. What I found is that the schools have teachers and principals and guidance counselors that are really working tremendously hard, but they just don't have resources. We're in a world where I remember back in 2000, I had the wonderful opportunity to go to Vietnam. It was 23 hours of travel, but I went all the way around the world. It's a 12-hour time difference. Went all the way around the world, put my ATM in a machine, and got money out. Now, if I can do that, that means that, number one, our economy is global. Number two, your education is global and should be. But the question is, are these kids actually being prepared for a global economy? Are they getting a global education and access to information about what's going on in the world? If you don't have computers, if you don't have an up-to-date library, how can you really do that? How can you compete with everyone else? If by the time they get to 5th grade, the people that build prisons base the number of cells they build on 4th grade reading scores. So if your child is in kindergarten and that school's not working for him or her, by the time they get to 4th, 5th grade, there's a cell already being built for them. The odds are already against them. If by the time they get to high school, the average black 12th grader is reading on the same level as the average white 8th grader, there is a phenomenal achievement gap there. They're not able to compete, and we have to get these students to a point where they compete in a global economy, not just to get a job in a local supermarket. While that's fine in one sense, because they are working, but we as adults have to be responsible enough to say that our children need all the resources that we can give them to compete in ways that everyone else is competing. And your zip code should not determine your level of achievement. And that's what's happening right now. And the biggest challenge for me as a community resident, but certainly as a state senator, is to make sure that the zip codes that my district covers will produce children that will compete with every other child in every other zip code in the city of New York.
You've had the benefit of an excellent education. There seems to be a debate in Harlem and your district around the charter school, public school issue.
Yes.
What's your position on that?
I support public education broadly. No matter what we do, no matter where we are, we have to support kids in public schools. I support charters in part because there is evidence that the children are achieving in these schools, and we should promote best practices. There's some great traditional public schools in the district too that are doing a lot with a little, and some that are actually getting a lot of private dollars and are doing some phenomenal work. Thurgood Marshall Academy, Frederick Douglass Academy are 2 examples of that. We should be promoting the best practices of those schools also. So I do support charters because I support the fact that a lot of them have had records of achievement. And there are a lot of parents that want that choice. My parents had a choice, and I would deny the same choices or similar choices to other parents that want to exercise that right. However, we also should be spending a lot of time looking at how to fix traditional public schools.
Harlem is clearly a cultural mecca for people around the world, between the Apollo and other celebrities and institutions uptown. Are there ways that Harlem hasn't reached its potential as a cultural, sports, church, tourist beacon for New York as well as the United States? And how would you, as a state senator, help enhance that role?
Well, I think culturally, Harlem retains its place on the cultural map of the United States as the capital of Black American politics, culture, music. And I think it has been that for some time and will continue to be. The Harlem Renaissance has sparked a phenomenal growth in African American culture, music, poetry, short stories, you name it. And it still is that and will be that going forward. I think on the city and state level, you're seeing a lot of the cultural monies being cut across the board. And so one of the things that I think is really important is when we talk about schools and education is that we find ways to put those programs back into local schools so that we may have a generation of artists now, but are we actually growing the next generation of artists? So I think that we need to be very careful of, because while I think there are a lot of cultural institutions, small organizations or big ones that are doing okay, there are a lot more that are existing on the margins. But I am concerned about the next generation of artists that aren't being nurtured because of the budget cuts. So that's the first thing. Tourism, I think it's interesting, because I'll actually tie it into churches. I think tourism is booming in Harlem. In fact, there are probably in some churches as many tourists as there are local congregants in some of the churches uptown. And one of the things that I think, even though tourism I think is okay, and there are a lot of tourists certainly patronizing businesses in Harlem, but what's happening with a lot of the churches is a little concerning, because a lot of the older residents are starting to move or pass on, and the churches are not bringing in as many young people as they would probably like to keep those churches going and vibrant. There are a lot of ministers, Reverend Beelan at Bethel AME, Reverend Waldron at First Corinthian Baptist Church, and there are others. There's a young guy, Jesse Williams, over at Convent, that are actually really going out of their way to find ways to bring in a lot of younger congregants. But in many ways, their older congregants are really the ones keeping it together. And I don't want to say they're struggling, but there are many that would really like to see some greater support for their institutions, particularly ones like Mother Zion. That's a church that Frederick Douglass visited, the oldest black church in the state of New York. And we need to find ways to support some of these institutions, because they are part of the spiritual and cultural fabric of Upper Manhattan, of Harlem, and they're existing on the margins right now. So that's one thing that I would really like to address as a senator. It's how we can fill our churches not just with younger congregants, but maybe get some young ministers to be apprentices in these churches and be in a position to take them over. You need that in politics too, and that's what we're not getting as well. So you have people like me coming in as insurgents and saying, you know, it's our time. We weren't necessarily nurtured, but now we need to do this because we think we represent that part of the constituency.
What do you think are the most successful private-public partnerships that are currently existing in Harlem, and what would you like to see, how would you like to see more develop?
Sure, I'll give you three distinct areas. I think what's happened uptown with housing is an interesting example. When I moved to Harlem within the first few years, I lived in a brownstone that was renovated through Abyssinian Development Corporation, and that was done with some public money and some private money to get a lot of these brownstones renovated and keep the rents and purchase prices low. So that, plus some of the other things that former Borough President C. Virginia Fields helped usher in. This is money that Ed Koch put away years ago when he was mayor and just let sit in the bank. You started to see a lot of these developments actually come up in Harlem. So if you go down 8th Avenue, for example, from 110th all the way up to the 120s, but when I first moved into Harlem, so many of the properties that exist now did not exist. They were open lots or they were buildings that were unlivable. But now that corridor along Frederick Douglass 8th Avenue is bustling with new new housing, new restaurants, new businesses, and that's a really great example of how you can actually turn a community around using public and private dollars. I'll talk about two more very quickly. What's happening with the charter schools? Harlem has, if any neighborhood in the city, the greatest concentration of charter schools. They still educate a small percentage of the total students that are up there, but they are a result of public and private dollars coming together to promote excellence in education. Some of them have failed and have been closed because they weren't doing well, but the ones that are doing well are doing very well. And if I can actually find a way to replicate that in the traditional public school, bringing private monies to bear to try to help build or rebuild a school, even if it's something like getting a publishing house to donate books to a library in the school. I think that's an example of public-private partnerships being able to actually work for the community. And the last thing, there are a lot of community gardens around the district. And I know that in conjunction with the City of New York, Bette Midler has for years with her foundation tried to rebuild some of these spaces and done a fantastic job doing that. So it's three pretty good examples of how they work in the community.
Well, I wonder if you would agree that the Manhattan Neighborhood Network as a public cable access facility is some sort of public-private partnership. I mean, we exist because the cable companies, Time Warner and RCN, were allowed to dig up the streets and lay cable.
Right.
Their give back to the community for that permission is funding a facility like this, providing education, cameras, training, staff, and it used to be that that MNN made community grants so that individual nonprofits and churches could teach and make programming. That's changed. Cable access is still out there, but as a state senator, what could you do to help, first of all, renew the franchise agreement that expired 2 years ago, and finally bring the long-discussed satellite facility of MNN in Harlem, bring that to fruition, because it hasn't happened for the last 10 years.
I would fight for that tremendously, and I'll give you an interesting example of why. I was talking not too long ago about a very large church in Brooklyn where the pastor runs such a big church with so many interesting programs that he has a production facility in the church where they do both TV and radio production. Now, what's interesting about that is you wouldn't normally think of this as sort of a function of a church, but what they're doing is they're actually training people to get these types of jobs in corporate America, should they decide to do that. And if we could find ways to bring MNN up to Harlem, we could be doing the exact same thing, not through a church necessarily, but that's something that I think should be a very, very valuable and worthwhile venture. So I'd be happy to work on that as a state senator.
How are you going to fight to get a good allocation of both state and federal dollars to the district, where that's been traditionally a problem in terms of the allocation of education dollars? The
charter schools, in part, were supposed to sort of solve that problem by bringing in private monies to be able to fill that gap. And honestly, it's hard to say if you're an executive, it's hard to say as a legislator that you can, you will certainly be able to impact the budget, but the job of the executive is to cut in times of recession. As a legislator, I'd certainly be able to fight for those monies, particularly so that we don't lay off a lot of teachers, because there are some wonderful teachers out there, young and old, that want to teach, and I would hate to see them go. But also, as a leader, you have to find ways to work with a lot of the private sector institutions that want to do work in your community or may not have thought to do that before, and just get them to put a little money here and there, a little resources here and there to actually help build or rebuild a school. If I can, I'll give you a very quick example. My mother teaches in Queens. The principal and a couple of teachers wanted to build a home ec lab in the school. They went with their own money to Home Depot to try to buy some supplies. The manager said, "Why are you doing that? I'll do it for you." He gave $5,000 to the school. They used that money to buy $5,000 to $10,000 worth of equipment, and the folks at Home Depot came in and built that lab themselves. If that's one small example of what you can do in every school in the district, and that's how I would find ways, not just fight to be able to get monies from my district, but if they don't come because the executive says, I'm not giving them to you, then I got to go find it somewhere else.
Okay, if we were to look at the United States from 30,000 feet, when you're on an airplane, you know, in this rather challenging economy, some people say that the most important exports that America has to offer the world are, number one, entertainment, whether that's sports, movies, TV, etc. Number two, higher education. People immigrate here from all over the world because of the quality of our higher education. Both of those things have their heart and soul on the Upper West Side and into Harlem. How might you, as a state senator, enhance the economic engine that those two kinds of industries can be for your district?
Well, that's an interesting question, because that's why, going back to your question about tourism, that's why we're getting so many tourists in the district. There are so many people. If you look over the last 10 years, the plethora of those double-decker red tour buses and those very large long-distance tour buses that are going through Harlem right now. People are eating at the restaurants, they're visiting cultural institutions. I live in a place on a block that's right around the corner. If some of you or some of our viewers may know of Jamel Mansion, Jamel Terrace, I live around there, and there are tour buses there all the time. I think there are people around the country and around the world who know about Harlem and are coming here. They're speaking Spanish, French, Portuguese, Italian, what have you, Japanese. They are visiting Harlem, and they are taking advantage of all that Harlem has to offer. One of the other points from an economic development standpoint is that, and going back to this, to the Columbia expansion and City College, if we can find ways that the community can really benefit from the expansion of Columbia and anything that's happening at City College, the purpose of their growth is to attract worldwide attention, more so than they have been, to attract grant monies and research monies. And if you're bringing another sort of wave of international researchers, international students, if you are building out, so to speak, to be able to do that, thus your expansion, then the community should benefit as a result of that. These institutions on their own have international standing. Harlem itself, in Upper Manhattan, Morningside Heights, Washington Heights, has international standing. The Dominican community in Washington Heights, phenomenal. A significant sense of entrepreneurial activity up there. There is international attention already in this district, on this community. What the goal for a state senator like me would be is to get the community to be able to take advantage of the people coming here more so than they are now, to benefit from all of that activity, not just the institutions themselves, but the residents as well. And that would be my challenge as a state senator.
As a graduate of Columbia College, I feel like I get confronted very highly emotionally by Harlem residents and by people of color, you know, especially around the Audubon Ballroom.
That's right.
And the way that the character and the population of, you know, New Columbia buildings don't necessarily welcome and embrace the locals. Are there, you know, sort of one or two, I guess, gimmies that Columbia could make to kind of put a Band-Aid on those sort of bad feelings and bad expectations, you know, that are specific and not general?
Well, during the early conversations about the expansion of the campus, there was some dialogue with the community board, for example, and some of the architects and consultants on the expansion to talk about to touch on what I mentioned before, which is that the older campus seemed to be designed to keep people out. And a lot of the campus and its officials didn't have a tremendous amount of constructive engagement. The Autobahn is a perfect example. I actually live near there, and that's a great example of an opportunity that the university had to really build a bridge with the community, but it was an extraordinarily contentious issue. But with this expansion, I know a lot of the consultants went out of their way to say, you know, we're going to build buildings differently. We want them to be a little more transparent. We want there to be more glass and less concrete. We want people to be able to actually see through the buildings so that they feel more connected and engaged. One other issue with the expansion is the concern about green space and open space for the community. If you look at the existing core campus of Columbia, it's the continuation of 116th Street, but it's actually not really an open street. It actually can be closed off at any time that the university wants to close it off, so it's not tremendously public, although it sort of acts like public space. There was a big concern about whether or not that would actually be available, that there would be these open spaces in the area of the expansion. And I know that there's still going to be more conversation. Whatever is proposed to be built may change over time, you know, because this is a 20 to 30 year project. But the community's concerns are valid and based on their perception and some reality of the older relationship with the university. But again, you have to be at the table to have the dialogue with the university if you want to be heard. And going back to my opponent, he has actually withdrawn from the board of the local development corporation. So the senator that represents the area does not have that voice, and the people need that voice. So that's what I mean about constructive engagement. We should be at the table having this dialogue on a consistent basis, and I'm sad to say that that the senator from the area has withdrawn himself from that discussion.
Looking at entities like Costco and Target and new big companies coming to Harlem, how do you balance the needs, their needs and the economic development impact of companies like that with the needs of working families and Harlem residents? Right.
I think it has to be a bit of a mix. I don't want to see a lack of commercial or economic development opportunities in the district, because I just talked about the fact that the community desperately needs jobs. But I do think we should not be creating a situation where the small business owner, potential or current, does not have the opportunity to open up their small business or expand what they have. I want the jobs to come into the community. I think the empowerment zone was a good idea and a good concept and brought some economic development there. There's a path mark on 125th and Lexington, which nobody said was going to, people fought tooth and nail. Some people said it wasn't going to work, and if you go into that path mark at 2 o'clock in the morning, it's still bustling. People will go to these stores. People will patronize these stores, these companies. They'll go to the Magic Johnson Theater because they do want to see that kind of economic development. But we should just find ways to protect the small business owner that wants to set up shop, put out their shingle in Harlem. And I think you can do that legislatively. You could do that with some thoughtful leadership as well.